He wasn't the target, so who was? Welcome to Hercule Puzzles. I am your host, Craden. Drop a comment, tell me where you're watching from. It's always a thrill seeing how far this mystery travels. Now, to the case. In the glow of 1,000 flickering candles, and under the refined veneer of polite conversation, the stately drawing room of the venerable Montclair estate shimmered with an air of genteel sophistication. The evening had been crafted as a celebration of high society, a reunion of old friends and promising acquaintances who had come, each with their own secrets cloaked beneath silk and satin, to share in an opulent feast. Yet, as the clock neared midnight, an unsettling pall fell over the gathering, a harbinger of the inexplicable events to come. It was then, in that hushed hour when whispers carried the weight of a cautionary tale, that a scream shattered the comfortable silence. Guests froze mid-sentence, and the jovial notes of a string quartet ceased as abruptly as the life of a candle extinguished by a careless breeze. In the center of the parlor, beneath the somber portrait of the estate's illustrious founder, lay a figure that seemed both oddly serene and disconcertingly out of place. The victim, Miss Evelyn Dupree, a woman whose charm had long captivated the eyes and hearts of many in society, had been found sprawled across an antique Persian rug. Her eyes, now wide open in an expression of uncanny surprise, stared skyward as if beseeching the heavens for an explanation. It was as though she had been marked not by the inevitability of age or the frailties of a mortal wound, but by something far more sinister, a life unjustly ended when it should have persisted. Impervious to the accidental cruelty of fate, a hush blanketed the room as one among the guests, her voice trembling with apprehension, murmured, "But she was not meant to die." The irony of those words gnawed at the edges of every mind present, for Evelyn had been known not only for her radiant beauty and warm laughter, but also for her resolute spirit, one that promised many more years of cheerful conversation and refined entertainment. Little did the assembled company know that this single startling moment would unravel a tapestry of deceit, ambition, and long-buried grudges. As the initial shock faded into disquieted murmurs, several figures began to exchange furtive glances. The grandeur of the estate, with its high arched windows and a gleaming chandelier that cast intricate patterns on the marble floor, seemed to conspire in silence, its very opulence a stark contrast to the grin to blow in its midst. Among the shocked and bewildered guests was one whose calm demeanor under pressure often served as the anchor in turbulent times, a man of measured words and unerring precision of thought. Although he had yet to appear on the scene in person, the reputation of his extraordinary investigative powers was known to all. Even in the midst of chaos, there was an unmistakable anticipation, a silent acknowledgement that the sharp, perceptive mind of Hercule Poirot was about to breathe order into the disarray. At that moment, while the household staff hesitated on the threshold of the room, and local constabulary murmured about the proper procedures in such delicate circumstances, the atmosphere was laden with an almost palpable sense of foreboding. Every guest, each a polished gem of the upper echelons, suddenly appeared to harbor hidden depths and undisclosed whispers. Behind their courteous exteriors lay motives and secrets that promised to complicate the narrative of an event that had swiftly morphed into a perplexing mystery. The air, heavy with the lingering scent of expensive perfume and the musk of aged wood, seemed to confide the irony of the circumstance. A victim whose life had been snatched away in a moment that defied logical explanation. How could a woman who had navigated life with such careful poise fall prey to an end marked by inexplicable brutality? The questions swirled in the minds of those present, as if in a silent vow that the truth must be unveiled despite the layers of deception shrouding it. In the drawing room, the interplay of light and shadow mirrored the impending battle of wits that would unfold, one where every carefully chosen word, every deliberate gesture, held a clue to a crime meticulously orchestrated. Under the guise of high society's revelry, the guests, each with their own complex histories and understated aspiration, became unwilling players in a drama that would soon expose the vulnerability hidden behind their carefully curated facades. Thus, with a lingering chill in the air and a palpable tension that seemed to etch itself into every carved detail of the room, the stage was set for a most singular investigation, a testament to the hidden intricacies of human nature, where the apparent and the real waged a constant, silent war. In this moment of still shock, as the body of Miss Evelyn Dupree lay in quiet testament to an unfinished story, the promise of revelation and retribution was unmistakably near, awaiting the arrival of the one man whose methodical mind and dazzling acumen had the power to strip away every layer of deceit. This shocking discovery, imbued with mystery and moral complexity, was only the beginning, a prologue to a tale where every polished smile concealed a secret, and every glint of the candlelight held a whisper of the truth yet to be told. And so, with a clandestine resolve stirring in the hearts of those privy to the unfolding drama, the promise of Hercule Poirot's imminent involvement began to ripple through the corridors of Montclair Estate, heralding the commencement of an investigation that would soon consume the souls of all within its grasp. It was precisely 8:37 in the morning when the sleek black motor car eased its way up the winding gravel path to the entrance of Montclair Estate. The fog, still clinging low to the hills, seemed to part slightly at the arrival of its unexpected guest, as if even the elements recognized the gravity of his presence. From the rear passenger door stepped a small, impeccably dressed man with a bowler hat, a tailored dark grey suit, and a walking cane he clearly didn't require, but carried with ceremonial elegance. His waxed mustaches curved upward with the same precision as the crease in his trousers. Hercule Poirot had arrived. He paused briefly before entering the manor, eyes flicking across the scene with deliberate slowness. Nothing escaped him: the uneven footprints leading from the path to the entryway, the absence of tire marks beside the hedges, the subtle tension etched into the expressions of the staff who stood waiting in uncertain silence. Even before crossing the threshold, Poirot had already begun his investigation, not of facts, but of people, their behavior, and their attempts to appear unaffected by the tragic events of the previous night. Inside, the drawing room had been preserved almost exactly as it had been found, save for the removal of the body. Poirot entered, his steps quiet on the tiled floor, and allowed his gaze to absorb every detail The overturned champagne glass near the chaise lounge, the smudge of red on the brass doorknob, the slight misalignment of a candlestick on the mantelpiece. Without needing to touch anything, he took in the evidence and its subtle arrangement. But more than that, he listened to the silence, to the tension in the air, and to the lingering energy of a gathering turned macabre. Poirot was soon joined by Inspector Nolan, a young and efficient local officer who had taken preliminary control of the case. "Monsieur Poirot," he said with a respectful nod, though not without a hint of defensiveness in his posture, "we've sealed the room, taken statements from the guests, and moved the body to the local mortuary. It looks like a poisoning, possibly in her drink." Poirot lifted one eyebrow slightly, then gestured toward the silver tray near the divan. "And this is the glass in question. We?" And no one saw the moment it was poured. Several glasses were poured. She had only a few sips before collapsing. No one else touched that glass afterward. "We believe the poison was fast-acting, but subtle, no smell, no visible residue. Fast-acting poisons do not work in isolation." "Mon cher," Poirot murmured as he moved past Nolan, "they require intention, and intention is always personal." As he spoke, Poirot's eyes drifted to the doorway, where a line of nervous house guests had begun to assemble once more. Their presence was not officially required yet, but it was human nature, part curiosity, part fear. Poirot always found that the truth often wandered into view if one simply watched people when they thought themselves unobserved. There was Lady Honoria Bexley, the estate's hostess and heiress to a textile fortune, who stood composed and cold, her silver hair pulled into an unyielding chignon. Her husband, Major Reginald Bexley, was a stoic man with a stiff posture and clenched jaw who had served in India, and rarely spoke unless necessary. Behind them loitered Philip Grant, a brooding playwright with ink-stained fingers and a history of scandal, and Miss Clara Vine, a socialite with a delicate constitution and a flair for melodrama. Then came Dr. Lionel Greaves, a family physician with impeccable manners, and finally a new face, Mr. Lucian Drake, a recent acquaintance of Evelyn's who had been introduced into their circle only a month prior and carried himself with an unsettling ease. Poirot studied each of them as they passed, nodding courteously but saying little. Instead, he turned to Inspector Nolan. "You will allow me, perhaps, to conduct my own series of interviews, quietly, one by one. The truth, it does not respond well to interrogation. It must be coaxed, like a shy cat." Nolan agreed, stepping aside as Poirot selected the first guest to speak with. It was Lady Honoria, who entered the adjoining salon with poise and placed herself in a straight-backed chair. Opposite Poirot, she folded her gloved hands neatly in her lap. "Madam," Poirot began, "you hosted this soirée. Tell me, was there tension between any of the guests prior to the incident?" She did not blink. "There's always tension at these sorts of events. People drink, people talk, but nothing unusual, certainly nothing that would suggest a murder." Poirot tilted his head. "And Miss Dupree? Was she well liked by all? She was admired," Lady Honoria said, "with a trace of something sharp beneath the surface, and envied. I suppose she had a way of drawing attention, especially from the men. Even your husband. A brief pause. Reginald was polite to everyone. Poirot gave a small nod of thanks, and the lady departed with no further comment. But already a pattern had begun to form in his mind, not of physical evidence, but of emotional residue, jealousy, pride, secrets carefully shielded by manners and wealth. Evelyn Dupree had not simply been the life of the party, she had been its disruptor, its irritant, its danger. Each guest would have their version of the night's events. Poirot would hear them all, and between the spoken words and the silences that followed them, he would find the single thread that unraveled the lie. As he called in the next guest, Poirot allowed himself a single thought, a reflection not of facts, but of instinct. Evelyn Dupree had not been the intended victim. That much he already suspected. But if that were true, then the person who was meant to die was still very much alive, and somewhere in this very house. Poirot's methods were never rushed. He knew that truth, when hurried, often dressed itself in the garments of assumption. So he continued his series of interviews, not with the urgency of a man solving a case under pressure, but with the calm of one deciphering a human riddle that would, inevitably, unfold before him if approached with precision. Next came Major Reginald Bexley, who entered the salon with military stiffness and a thin veneer of reluctance, his heels clicking against the polished floor with rhythmic finality. "I didn't care much for Miss Dupree," he said bluntly, before Poirot could ask anything of significance. "I found her company tiresome and her effect on the younger men distracting. But I assure you, I had no quarrel with her." "Distracting, Major?" Poirot inquired gently. "To whom?" "To Philip Grant, for one. To Lucy and Drake. Even Dr. Greaves, if you ask me." He adjusted the cuffs of his uniform as though straightening his conscience. "This isn't the sort of thing that should happen in a respectable house." "Indeed," Poirot murmured, "respectability is often disturbed by the things that go unsaid." The Major narrowed his eyes, but offered no further elaboration. He stood, nodded stiffly, and left. Poirot made no attempt to detain him. Some truths he had learned were most easily revealed through the inconsistencies of the tongue when it pretended to be firm. The next interview was with Philip Grant. He arrived with the air of someone who had rehearsed his role, casual yet rehearsed, crossing his legs and speaking before he was asked anything. "I suppose everyone will look to the dramatist when tragedy strikes," he said with a faint smirk. "I assure you, monsieur, I deal in fiction, not poison." Poirot inclined his head politely. "You knew Miss Dupree well, well enough to admire her, not well enough to mourn her, if that's what you're suggesting." "That is not what I am suggesting. I only ask, was there tension between you and any of the guests?" Philip's gaze flicked briefly toward the closed doors before returning to Poirot. "Between myself and the others, no. But Evelyn had an uncanny way of stirring things. She wasn't cruel, not deliberately, just provocative. She enjoyed seeing what people would reveal when they were uncomfortable. Not everyone appreciated that talent. Did you? I found it useful. She was a mirror. People hated what they saw in her because it reminded them of what they hid in themselves. Poirot studied him a moment longer. And yet, someone saw in her something worth killing. Philip's smirk faded slightly, but he said nothing more. Poirot dismissed him with a nod, already filing away the subtle evasions and the carefully chosen words. Next was Miss Clara Vine. She entered the salon with hesitation, her eyes darting around the room as though it might contain ghosts. She took the chair opposite Poirot with the slow, practiced grace of a woman used to being watched. "This is horrible," she whispered. I still can't believe it." "Miss Vine," Poirot said softly, "tell me what you saw, not just with your eyes, but with your heart. What did you feel last night?" Clara hesitated, her gloved hands twisting in her lap. "I felt watched, like something was about to happen. There was a tension all night. Evelyn, she was more animated than usual. She said something I can't remember exactly, something about the past catching up to everyone eventually." Poirot nodded slightly. "Was there a specific guest she said this to?" Clara shook her head. "I don't think so. She just said it aloud, like a warning or maybe a threat. And then she laughed. But it wasn't a kind laugh. Did she seem afraid?" "No, not afraid. Almost triumphant." "Merci," Poirot said, gently ushering her out. The picture of Evelyn Dupree continued to sharpen, a woman playing a game. Only she knew the rules, too. A woman who perhaps had learned something about someone in that room, something she could no longer keep to herself. The next visitor was Dr. Lionel Greaves, dignified and calm, as physicians so often trained themselves to be. "I examined the body," he began, "before the authorities arrived. It was consistent with poisoning convulsions, discoloration, rapid collapse. You were the first to reach her, yes. I was standing nearest when she collapsed. You did not attempt to resuscitate her. There was nothing to be done. The symptoms progressed too quickly. I believe it was digitalis. It acts rapidly, especially if undiluted. And would such a substance be easily obtained?" Greaves offered a quiet smile. "I imagine I'd be your first suspect. Then Poirot did not return the smile. "Monsieur, everyone in this house is a suspect, but only one is a murderer. It is not my concern who could have done it. It is my task to find who did." Greaves nodded. "You may ask me anything." Poirot did not reply. Instead, he made a small note in his pocketbook and gestured toward the door. He would return to Dr. Greaves. There was something to tidy about his answers. The final interview of the morning was Lucian Drake, the newcomer, the outsider. He entered with confidence, but Poirot detected a flicker of calculation behind the pleasant mask. "You must be Hercule Poirot. An honor. Evelyn spoke highly of you. She used to say you could see through walls." "Not quite," Poirot replied, "but I do notice things others miss." Lucian smiled. "And what have you noticed about me?" "That you are trying very hard to seem comfortable." Drake leaned forward slightly. "I met Evelyn last month. We were close, but not serious. I don't know anyone else here particularly well. I'm afraid I'm the least helpful person you'll speak with." "On the contrary, monsieur," Poirot said. "Those who are least known are often the most interesting." Poirot did not question him further. "The less," he asked, the more Lucien seemed to want to fill the silence. But Poirot had learned long ago, some men unravel more easily when left to wonder what you know, and why you haven't said it. When the final guest had departed, and the sun stood higher over the estate's immaculate hedges, Poirot stepped into the garden terrace and looked out over the trimmed paths and stone fountains. Every interview had brought him closer to the contours of truth, but something did not sit right. Evelyn Dupree had not been the sort to inspire random violence. Her death had meaning not because of who she was, but because of what she had seen, or said, or threatened to say. And more curiously still, someone in that house was hiding a motive that had nothing to do with Evelyn at all. Someone had wanted another person dead, and Evelyn had gotten in the way. Poirot's brow furrowed slightly. There was a difference, always, between the intended victim and the actual victim. It was not only who had motive, but for whom the motive was originally meant. He returned to the drawing room. It was time to begin again, not with the facts as presented, but with the questions unasked. Poirot stood alone in the drawing room once more, his eyes sweeping slowly across the space, as though the walls themselves whispered secrets. The traces of Evelyn Dupree's final moments remained, a faint scuff on the rug where her heel had twisted as she fell, the scent of perfume still lingering in the air, and the half-drunk glass of champagne that had sparked the initial theory of poisoning. He approached the silver tray again, peering down at the untouched glasses beside hers. Something about their symmetry struck him not visually, but circumstantially. Why had only Evelyn's been touched when several had been poured? A servant entered quietly. Poirot turned. "Pardon, monsieur," the young footman said. "Inspector Nolan requested I bring in the rest of the glassware to be taken for testing." Poirot gestured to the tray. "Leave everything as it was. I do not trust the movements of objects after a crime not until I understand who moved what, and why." The footman hesitated. "Yes, monsieur." He left, unnerved by Poirot's penetrating gaze. With the room once again to himself, Poirot took a slow turn about its perimeter. The corners of the room interested him more than the center. Parties, he often noted, were like performances, attention always gathered in the spotlight. But the truest expressions of intent occurred in the wings, where people whispered or watched from shadows. It was there that motives revealed themselves, not in what was done, but in what was avoided. He paused at the French doors leading to the garden. One was unlocked. Poirot unlatched it and stepped outside. The gravel path ran straight toward the hedge maze, and to the right, toward the side entrance of the estate. No footprints. The night's wind and the morning dew had erased all but the most recent movements inside. Inspector Nolan was gathering testimonies from the servants. Poirot joined him in the service hallway, where the butler, a man named Stratham, recited the evening sequence with well-practiced composure. "Miss Dupree arrived late, monsieur, nearly a full hour after the others had gathered. She came alone, but in high spirits, requested a glass of the 27 rose. Unusual?" Poirot asked. "She was usually a champagne lady. I'd wager she had something on her mind. Or perhaps she wanted to be noticed." Poirot nodded. Who poured the champagne when she arrived? I did, the butler replied. But she never drank from the glass I poured. She was handed another by Mr. Drake. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. And did anyone see that? Several guests were present. The switch was subtle. Seemed like he was being gallant. Poirot said nothing for a moment. A man with poison in his hand. And yet the wrong woman drank it. Or had it been meant for her after all? He returned to the drawing room, where Nolan was now holding a small velvet box. Found this under one of the lounge chairs, he said. Jewelry. Belonged to Miss Dupree. Poirot opened the box. Inside was a brooch, a striking emerald set in gold. He recognized it at once. Evelyn had worn it just the night before, pinned to the collar of her gown. But now it was here, hidden as if discarded, or removed. Strange, Poirot said. Why? Would she remove it? Nolan shrugged. Maybe it fell off. Poirot gave a tight smile. Nothing valuable falls off without being noticed. And Miss Dupree would never leave her jewels behind. No, this was removed. By someone else, or by her. Deliberately, Poirot motioned to the tray again. Have the glasses tested, if you like. But I believe the poison was never in the glass. Nolan raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Consider, mon ami. She barely sipped it. No traces remain on her lips. No smell. No sign of nausea before collapse. And yet violent convulsions. Rapid expiration? No. I think it was administered some other way. Perhaps earlier in the evening. Perhaps with her own hand. Though I doubt. Do you think she was murdered with something disguised? Poirot tapped the brooch. Perhaps a pin. A scratch on the skin. Something absorbed transdermally. We must examine the clasp. Nolan took the box and signaled for it to be examined more closely. Poirot returned to the garden path. His thoughts circling not the physical act of murder, but the architecture of intent. The person who committed this crime had done so not in haste, but with deliberation. They had calculated the effect of every movement, every gesture, and yet they had made a mistake, a detail too clever for its own good. He called for Lucian Drake again, requesting a walk in the garden. The younger man complied, adjusting his cufflinks as they strolled down the gravel path. Tell me, monsieur, Poirot said, what did you and Miss Dupree argue about before dinner? Lucian blinked. Argue? Yes, you raised your voice. She laughed in response. You were upset. Lucian gave a thin smile. We weren't arguing. It was a misunderstanding. I had mentioned something from her past, a foolish anecdote. She didn't appreciate the reminder. Poirot nodded slowly. And what did you say exactly? Lucian paused. That a leopard cannot change its spots. Poirot raised an eyebrow. And what spots did she bear, monsieur? Lucian said nothing. His smile hardening, Poirot turned away, watching a bird settle on the iron railing. The silence lengthened. She had many admirers, Lucian finally said. Too many. It created tension. Among the other men, among the women too. Poirot considered that, then. Tell me, did she ever threaten to expose someone? Lucian's eyes flicked sideways. Not directly. But Evelyn had a way of implying things. She liked leverage. Poirot walked ahead, his pace slow, then turned suddenly, and yet she is gone. Her leverage gone with her. Curious, is it? Not Lucian said nothing. Poirot allowed the moment to hang, then excused himself and returned to the estate. Inside, the house had shifted. The guests were quieter now, their voices softer, more restrained. It was the silence of fear not of discovery, but of anticipation. Poirot recognized it. Somewhere among them was the person whose plan had failed, not because Evelyn was the victim, but because someone else, the true target, was still alive. False clues had been left deliberately: the poisoned glass, the jewelry under the chair, the suggestion of jealous lovers. But Poirot's instinct told him that the murderer was not driven by jealousy or impulse. No, this was a crime built upon foresight. The kind of crime that only faltered when fate interrupted the plan. Evelyn Dupree had not been meant to die, but someone else, someone very specific, very quiet, was meant to. And the true killer was watching carefully to see if they needed to act again. The estate remained unusually still that afternoon, its stately charm now an uneasy backdrop to a truth that seemed to shift with every passing hour. Poirot, seated once again in the morning room with his hands steepled before him, had not moved in over 20 minutes. Yet his mind was ablaze. The interviews, the gestures, the fragments of half-truth soul had taken root within him. And now, like the slow bloom of a puzzle flower, something deeper had begun to unfold. He summoned Lady Honoria Bexley once more, not out of suspicion, but curiosity. She arrived briskly, her footsteps sharp on the polished floor, her demeanor tightly composed. "Lady Honoria," Poirot said gently, "you have lived in this house longer than any other present guest. You know its history. Tell me, if you please, about Evelyn Dupree's connection to this place before last evening." Honoria's lips thinned. "She was not a regular fixture in our circle. Only recently has she taken to appearing at our events. Again, years ago, she was, well, something of a scandal." Ah, Poirot leaned forward slightly. "The kind of scandal that is spoken in euphemism and buried behind polite smiles?" "She was once engaged to Philip Grant," Honoria said, folding her hands in her lap. "Briefly, it ended badly, publicly. Evelyn had a way of collecting powerful men and shedding them just as quickly. The engagement was called off after a dinner party here. In fact, when she humiliated him in front of guests. And she returned to this house, after all those years, with new money, a new reputation. She moved in circles again. I suspect she enjoyed the discomfort her presence caused. It was like a performance for her, yet no one objected to her invitation, not directly," Honoria said. But Reginald was displeased. Philip avoided her, and Clara's insecurities have always made her vulnerable to women like Evelyn. Poirot nodded once. "You paint a picture of tension one resurrected, not freshly drawn. She had a past with everyone here. That's why. This is so unpleasant. It's not simply a tragedy, monsieur. It's a disruption of our order." Poirot made no comment, but her words struck him with force. Evelyn had returned to this house not as a guest but as a catalyst. She had history with each of them, old grudges, embarrassments, secrets. Her murder had not been spontaneous, it was rooted in something long buried. When Lady Honoria left, Poirot asked for Philip Grant to return. The playwright appeared with mild annoyance, but he seated himself with the air of a man familiar with scrutiny. "Evelyn was once your fiancée," Poirot stated. Philip's jaw tightened. "Briefly, and yet you did not mention this, because it's ancient history, and I've no interest in gossip." Poirot's voice remained calm. "But history does not forget, monsieur, and neither do those humiliated in front of their peers. You ended the engagement, she did, publicly, cruelly. It was more spectacle than romance by the end. She toyed with people for amusement. Do you believe she returned here to toy with you again?" Philip's eyes flicked downward. "It wouldn't surprise me. And if she had discovered something new, something damaging to you, would she have stayed silent?" Philip didn't respond immediately. "Are you suggesting she was blackmailing me?" "I am suggesting she was dangerous to someone. Not because she wielded a knife or poison, but because she held something more destructive. Knowledge." Philip's silence confirmed enough. Poirot stood. "Merci, monsieur. That will be all. By now." A faint outline had begun to form in Poirot's mind, a triangle of tension between Evelyn, Philip, and someone else. It was not a lover's jealousy, nor a simple scandal. It was about reputations, about leverage, about something Evelyn had once buried, only to now bring back to light. Poirot requested Miss Clara Vine next. She entered with more poise than before, as though she'd rehearsed for this encounter. Her mascara had been reapplied. Her blouse subtly changed. She sat down gently, crossing her ankles. "Miss Vine," Poirot said gently, "did you know that Evelyn was once engaged to Mr. Grant?" Clara looked mildly surprised, though Poirot detected the feint. "I'd heard something like that, but I didn't know it was official." "Were you fond of Mr. Grant yourself?" Clara tilted her head. "He's fascinating, but not mine to chase. Evelyn had a habit of drawing in the men around her. Did that trouble you?" Clara smiled tightly. "If it did, monsieur, I wouldn't admit it." Poirot leaned forward. "But Evelyn did more than charm men, did she not? She uncovered truths. Tell me, mademoiselle, did she threaten to reveal something about you?" Clara's lips parted slightly. Poirot saw the flash of panic before she recovered. "No," she said, "nothing like that." But she was lying. Poirot was sure of it. Clara had something to hide, something Evelyn knew, and it had frightened her enough to rehearse every word she'd just spoken. After Clara left, Poirot summoned Dr. Greaves. He entered with calm familiarity, standing rather than sitting. "I've read the toxicology report," Nolan said, entering behind him. "Small traces of digoxin, lethal in the right dosage. It likely entered her bloodstream within the hour before death. We found microscopic puncture wounds on her neck, possibly from a brooch pin." Poirot nodded. "The poison was not in the glass?" "No," Nolan said. "We're focusing now on the jewelry." Dr. Greaves folded his arms. "This level of dosage, administered transdermally, is highly precise. Not many people would know how to prepare it." "A doctor might," Nolan added sharply. "I'm not the only doctor here," Greaves said coldly. "Evelyn was clever, Perhaps too clever. She had something on several people here. I warned her to stop toying with reputations. Poirot's brow lifted. Warned her, Doctor? Greaves looked away. She told me she had discovered something. About Lady Honoria. Nolan blinked. What sort of something? Greaves hesitated. A financial matter. Fraud, possibly. Evelyn said she had proof. She said she would make it public at the end of the summer. I advised her to burn it, but she didn't. Poirot asked. Greaves shook his head. Apparently not. Poirot remained still. One secret about Philip. One about Clara. Now, one about Lady Honoria. Evelyn had been collecting more than attention. She had been collecting leverage. And someone had silenced her before she could use it. But had the killer intended to silence Evelyn? That doubt remained. Later, Poirot returned to the room Evelyn had stayed in the night before. It had been sealed, untouched since the discovery of her body. Inside, he examined her handbag, her travel case, and finally, her journal. It was slim and locked, but Poirot, after careful work with a letter opener, cracked it open. Inside were names. Dates. One entry stood out. He thinks I've forgotten, but I remember it all. The lie, the switch, the will. If the truth ever came out, it would ruin more than one of them. Poirot read it 3 times. The lie. The switch. The will. This was not simply blackmail or jealousy. This was inheritance. And someone had murdered to stop a truth that would change everything. Poirot closed the journal, his face unreadable. There were more interviews to conduct, more lies to sort through. But the past, long buried, had finally stirred, and it had taken its first victim. Poirot did not sleep that night. While the rest of Montclair estate attempted to resume its rigid social structure, through forced conversation, quiet dinners, and polite silences, he remained in his room. Seated by the fire, the journal in his lap, the entry Evelyn had written days before her death was more than cryptic. It was a thread begging to be pulled. The lie, the switch, the will. These were not emotional grievances. These were legal ones, and perhaps fatal ones. Somewhere in this house, beneath the velvet of wealth and etiquette, a deception had occurred likely long ago, but its consequences had not faded. They had simply waited, dormant, until Evelyn's return lit the fuse. In the early hours, just after 5, Poirot ventured out into the hallway. The estate was silent. He moved softly, listening not for footsteps, but for patterns. Unlocked doors, recently oiled hinges, closed drawers left ajar. He made his way to the study Lord Bexley's private office, now largely unused since the Major had taken over residence, but never the title. Poirot had learned it had not been opened in years. But last night, it had been. The door opened with a faint creak. Inside, the furniture wore the scent of dust and time. Shelves lined the walls, filled with ledgers and thick manila folders labeled with years dating back to the 1890s. The desk bore the marks of regular use, once upon a time scratches, a slight indentation where a wristwatch might have rested each evening. Poirot opened the top drawer and began searching not for evidence, but for truth that had long been kept under lock. 10 minutes later, he found it, a smaller folder, misfiled between two volumes of local hunting records. It contained a copy of a will signed, witnessed, dated belonging to Lord Simon Bexley, the former owner of the estate. There was something peculiar about it. The document had been amended once, with a handwritten notation added near the bottom. The estate, originally divided equally among both sons and the family's foundation, had been changed. The second son's name had been stricken out. A new beneficiary had been added. The handwriting was nearly perfect to perfect. Poirot closed the folder and walked back into the corridor. That name, the one added in sharp, unmistakable ink, was not Reginald Bexley. It was Evelyn Dupree. The moment was interrupted by the soft sound of a floorboard shifting. Poirot turned. Down the hall stood Clara Vine, half-dressed in a robe, a glass of water in one hand. "I couldn't sleep either," she said, voice thin. "It's strange, isn't it, how death lingers?" Poirot studied her. "Did you come?" From the guest wing, she nodded. "Yes, strange," Poirot murmured. "You are on the opposite side of the house. There is no reason for your footsteps to lead here." Clara's expression faltered. "I walk when I'm anxious. I didn't mean to interrupt." Poirot did not reply. She left quickly, and he made note of the lie. Later that morning, Poirot called a private meeting with Inspector Nolan. They stood in the garden, away from the guests. "There are several matters I must share with you, monsieur," Poirot said, keeping his voice low. "First, the murder was not committed out of passion. It was committed out of preservation." Nolan frowned, meaning someone here changed the will of Lord Bexley legally. Evelyn discovered it. She had proof, likely she intended to expose it. Forgery, almost certainly. The amended portion names Evelyn as a beneficiary, but she never collected. She left the country shortly after Lord Bexley's death. It is possible she did not know until recently, and she came back to claim it. No, Poirot said. She came back to warn someone she knew the truth, perhaps to leverage it. But I do not believe Evelyn intended to harm anyone. Her crime was arrogance. She believed herself untouchable. Nolan rubbed his temples. "And who would have forged the will?" "That," Poirot said, "is what we must now determine. But we must do so delicately. If we confront the wrong person, the true killer may vanish, or strike again." That evening, Poirot took a different approach. He did not call another interview. He did not gather the guests. Instead, he watched. He seated himself in the lounge just after dinner and allowed the others to move about as they pleased. They spoke in low tones, scattered throughout the room, Major Bexley reading a newspaper, Clara Vine pretending to embroider, Philip Grant pacing by the window, Lucian Drake nursing a drink by the bar. Poirot noted their spacing, their gazes, their avoidance. He turned his attention to Major Reginald Bexley. "You are very quiet tonight." "Monsieur," the Major didn't look up. "Nothing to say." "You inherited the estate when your father passed?" "Yes." There was no dispute. The Major's jaw tightened. "None worth discussing." Poirot leaned back. "You must miss your father. He believed in order, discipline, not theatrics." Poirot tilted his head. "Theatrics, monsieur." The Major folded his paper. "Evelyn, She made a mockery of decency. She thrived on it. You were not fond of her. No, and yet, Poirot said softly, she once stood to inherit half of Montclair. The silence that followed was the sound Poirot had been waiting for. A flicker of awareness in the Major's eyes. A suppressed recognition that his foundation, everything he believed to be secured, had just cracked. Philip Grant approached soon after, trying to deflect with conversation about the inspector's handling of the case. Poirot allowed it. Lucien, as always, observed in silence. Clara, her eyes twitching with each mention of Evelyn's name, seemed to shrink by the minute. Poirot noticed every tick. Every glance, every microsecond of pause before a reply. After dinner, he excused himself and returned to his room, where he laid the will, the journal, and a page torn from the estate's library account in front of him. Clara had checked out a book 2 weeks prior on inheritance law. The record showed it had been returned the day Evelyn arrived. It was no longer a question of who had secrets. It was who had the most to lose, and who was willing to kill. To ensure the truth was never spoken aloud, Poirot stood at the window, watching. The moonlight cut across the gardens. One murder had already been committed, but he sensed something else. Someone was preparing for a second. The killer believed they were safe, that the mistaken identity had bought them time. But Poirot knew not who. Not quite. But he was close enough now to see how the pieces fit. All he needed was one misstep, and so he waited patiently, quietly. The game, at last, was beginning to unravel. It was just after noon when the second scream tore through Montclair estate. Poirot had been in the conservatory, quietly sipping his tisane, when the shriek cracked the fragile facade of civility. Once again, the sound came from the upper floor shop, terrified and unmistakably female. He set his cup down with care and rose, not rushing, but moving with purpose. He already knew what he would find. He had been expecting it. By the time Poirot arrived at the guest corridor, a cluster of people had already gathered outside Clara Vine's room. Inspector Nolan was elbowing his way through the crowd. Clara herself was sitting on the hallway floor, pale and trembling, her robe disheveled, her hands clutching a small object to her chest as if it could ward off death. In front of her, in the doorway of her room, lay the still form of Lucien Drake. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Lucien was sprawled face down, one arm tucked under his torso, the other extended as if he had reached for something. His skin was pallid, his lips faintly blue. Nolan bent beside him and felt for a pulse. After a moment, he stood. Dead, he said grimly. No signs of struggle, no blood. Poirot said nothing. He studied Clara first, not the body. Her eyes were locked on the floor. She was shaking, but not crying. Her knuckles were white against the small black book she clutched. Poirot knelt beside her. "Mademoiselle," he said gently. "What happened?" Clara shook her head, her voice a dry whisper. I don't know. I left breakfast early. I wasn't feeling well. I came back to my room. When I opened the door, he was already there, on the floor." "Was he waiting for you?" Poirot asked. "I don't think so. I think he must have been trying to go through my things." Poirot's Eyes flicked to the desk beyond the doorway, where a drawer hung open. He turned back to Clara. "Why were you carrying that book?" She looked down at it as though she'd forgotten it was in her hands. "It was in my drawer. I grabbed it. Without thinking. I didn't want anyone to take it. May I see it?" Reluctantly, she held it out. Poirot took it gently and opened the worn cover. Inside were several handwritten notes. Not Clara's handwriting, he recognized Evelyn Dupree's script instantly. Letters, copies of documents, perhaps even a draft of a statement, and on the final page, in bold, underlined ink. They switched the pages after the original will was signed. Reginald knew. He saw it happen. "If I disappear. This is why." Poirot's mouth pressed into a thin line. He closed the book and handed it to Nolan. "Seal this immediately. Guard it." He turned back to Clara. "You knew Evelyn had this." "She gave it to me," Clara whispered. "The night before she died, she said, if anything happened, I was to give it to someone I trusted. I didn't trust anyone." Poirot nodded once. "You did well, mademoiselle. Now, come, let us take you somewhere quiet." She allowed herself to be helped up and escorted away. Nolan stayed behind, calling for the coroner and securing the scene dot in the hallway. Poirot remained still for several minutes, allowing the silence to wrap around him like a coat. Evelyn had been the first warning. Now Lucien. But unlike Evelyn, Lucien had not been the one to upset the balance. He had been involved. But he was not the forger. Poirot was certain of that now. Lucien had been digging, and someone had caught him in the act. Poirot joined Nolan downstairs in the study, where the book now rested inside an evidence bag. Nolan's face was lined with fatigue. "This is more than a poisoning case," he muttered. "We're looking at years of deception." "Yes," Poirot agreed, "but we are close. The murderer grows reckless. They intended to kill someone else the first time. Evelyn was not the target, but after the mistake, they waited. And then clever Lucien started asking questions. "And Clara?" Nolan asked. "You think she's innocent?" Poirot shook his head. "I think she is scared. And scared people do not commit calculated murders with exotic poisons, and silence the dead before they speak." "Then who?" Poirot. The detective did not answer. Instead, he asked for the estate's financial ledgers and the original records of Lord Bexley's will. Over the next hour, he combed through the handwriting, the ink patterns, the signatures. He compared stroke pressure, alignment, margins, and finally, he found it a discrepancy so subtle it would have eluded anyone not obsessed with detail. The name Evelyn Dupree had been added in a different ink than the rest of the amendment, but it was the original removal the striking. Out of a second error that had been done first. Someone had altered the will into phases. Poirot stood slowly. "It is nearly time." "For what?" Nolan asked. "For the truth." They convened everyone in the drawing room at 6 o'clock. The guests were silent, subdued. No one dared touch their drinks. Poirot stood at the center of the room, with Inspector Nolan behind him. The weight of two deaths hung like a storm cloud over the gathering. Poirot's voice, when he spoke, was calm but absolute. "You all believed Miss Evelyn Dupree to be many things: manipulative, attention-seeking, meddlesome. But above all, she was observant, and she had discovered something. Someone here would kill to keep hidden. It was not gossip. It was not scandal. It was theft. Legal theft. A ripple passed through the room. Years ago, the will of Lord Bexley was altered, a page removed, a new clause inserted. The ink does not match, the stroke pressure changes, and the name Evelyn Dupree was added after the removal of another heir. He turned his eyes on Major Reginald Bexley. You inherited the estate unjustly, did you not? Monsieur, the Major stiffened. This is outrageous, Poirot continued. You saw the original will. You knew your father intended to divide the estate, but someone convinced him otherwise, or you acted after his death. Either way, Evelyn found proof. She told Clara. She hinted it to Lucien. And now, both of them have been marked. One is dead. One barely escaped. Poirot paced Evelyn's. Brooch was used to deliver the poison digitalis, applied to the pin. She was not meant to wear it. It was meant for Clara. Evelyn must have borrowed it that evening, unintentionally triggering the fatal switch. Gasps filled the room. Poirot turned, slowly, toward Lady Honoria Bexley. You were the last to see Evelyn before she joined the party. You helped her dress. You handed her the brooch. Honoria's eyes blazed. That proves nothing. It proves opportunity, Poirot said, and more importantly, motive. Evelyn was going to reveal that you, not your husband, had tampered with the will. Reginald may have inherited the estate, but the forgery was yours. You altered the legal records to protect your family name. And when Lucien began digging, you struck again. The silence was deafening. Lady Honoria stood still, her expression rigid. Then she spoke cool, sharp. I did what was necessary. That girl came into my house threatening ruin. She didn't belong in this world. She never did. Poirot gave a small nod. No one truly belongs when others draw the circle, madam. Inspector Nolan stepped forward. Lady Honoria Bexley, you are under arrest for the murders of Evelyn Dupree and Lucien Drake. No one spoke as she was led away. Reginald sat motionless. Philip stared at the floor. Clara covered her mouth with her hands. Poirot remained still. He had not merely uncovered a crime. He had unearthed a legacy of entitlement, deception, and desperation wrapped in pearls and manners. But as always, the little grey cells had done their work. The drawing room emptied slowly, like the final act of a long and exhausting play. The servants cleared the untouched teacups and closed the windows as night crept across the estate. Outside, the air was dense and motionless. Inside, it was no lighter. Lady Honoria's arrest had shaken the very foundation of Montclair, not only because of her actions, but because of the mirror it held up to everyone else. Each guest had been implicated not in murder, but in silence, in looking the other way, in preserving their comfort while the truth festered beneath the surface. Yet Poirot remained seated, unmoved, at the center of the room. Inspector Nolan returned after escorting the constables. They're taking her into custody now. There's no resistance. She didn't even protest the charges. Poirot nodded. But he did not seem satisfied. His eyes remained fixed on the hearth as if waiting for something else to emerge, something still. Out of reach. I thought that would be the end of it, Nolan said. You don't look convinced. Non, monsieur. It is too neat. Neat. Nolan frowned. You got the confession. You proved opportunity and motive. Poirot lifted his hand slowly and pointed toward the corner of the mantelpiece. Do you see that lamp? Nolan glanced. Yes, it was unplugged. During my first walkthrough after the murder, it was dark. The cord had been wound behind the table. Today, it was plugged in. Nolan raised an eyebrow, and Poirot stood now, smoothing the front of his waistcoat. Lady Honoria is meticulous. She would never leave the room unbalanced. Someone has been back in here since the arrest. Someone who believed the case was closed and who now feels relieved. He stepped forward, tapping the brooch clasp that still sat on the mantel, sealed in an evidence envelope. And this? Too obvious, too simple. Digitalis, yes, but administered. Through a brooch passed from hand to hand. A calculated killer would never rely on a chain of coincidence. The brooch required Evelyn to wear it. But what if she hadn't? You said yourself it was meant for Clara. I did, Poirot said, and I still believe that. But that plan depended too heavily on improvisation. Nolan crossed his arms. Are you saying Honoria didn't kill Evelyn? I am saying she did not act alone, and perhaps not at all in the original death. Poirot walked back to the chair, picked up the black book Evelyn had given Clara, and opened it once more to the final page. The handwriting here it is Evelyn's, but she writes not only about the will. She mentions a second lie. The switch happened during the blackout, not after. He told me it was Reginald, but it was never him. Blackout? Poirot nodded. 6 years ago, a storm cut power to the estate during Lord Bexley's final months. A night when the servants were sent away, the family remained inside, and the safe in the study was opened. Nolan shook his head. There's no record of that, exactly, because it was erased. Poirot paused. Monsieur, we must speak again with Philip Grant. Nolan hesitated. He's gone. Left this afternoon. Claimed it was too much. Poirot's mouth drew a flat line. No, no. He should not have been allowed to leave. He is the only one who benefits from every event that occurred. Think, Evelyn humiliates him publicly years ago. He is stripped of credibility, abandoned by his peers. Then she returns, gains power, threatens to reveal a forgery, possibly involving him. And Lucien, an outsider, starts asking questions. Yet somehow, both Evelyn and Lucien end up dead, and Philip slips quietly away. But he was only connected to Evelyn through an old engagement. Poirot turned. You forget the journal entry. She writes of he, not she, being the one who lied about the will. That he claimed Reginald had done it. But the real deception was that he had misled her from the beginning. Evelyn was deceived by someone she trusted, someone who pretended to help her. Philip. Evelyn was not just a former lover to him. She was a threat. She knew too much about him. Perhaps even that he was involved in the forgery, not to inherit, but to ruin Reginald, or Lady Honoria. Revenge. Nolan not profit. Nolan exhaled slowly. Then Honoria, an accomplice, perhaps. She may have turned a blind eye, but I doubt she had the technical means or initiative to prepare the poison or falsify legal documents. She is capable of arrogance, but not of detail. Poirot walked toward the bookshelf, running a hand along the volumes. Philip is a playwright, a man obsessed with structure, endings, misdirection. He crafted this entire performance. He knew Evelyn was dangerous, but also dramatic. She would make threats, not quietly disappear. So he used that. He used her instincts against her. Do you think he planted the brooch? I think he ensured Clara would receive it, and that Evelyn might take it by accident. That was the only part he couldn't control. When Evelyn died instead of Clara, he waited, watched, saw who reacted. And when Lucien began digging, he struck again, this time directly. Nolan swore softly. So how do we prove it? Poirot walked slowly to the chess table by the far wall and opened the small drawer beneath the board. Inside was a tiny glass vial, no bigger than a thimble. It was empty, but the label was intact. Digitalis, concentrated, prescribed 6 months ago in Geneva. The name on the bottle was not Evelyn's. It was Philip Grant. Poirot handed it silently to Nolan. By midnight, they had alerted the local station and begun the process of tracking Philip's location. But Poirot remained thoughtful, his expression unreadable. In his room, he reviewed the playbill from Philip's last performance, a modest tragedy. That closed after only 2 weeks. The critic's review, buried in the drawer with it, read, "A compelling narrative, but predictable. The twist comes too early, and the ending leaves little to savor." Poirot smiled faintly at the irony. He had, in the end, seen the same flaw. Philip Grant had constructed a clever crime, but he had delivered his twist to soon poison in Act 1, silence in Act 2. And Poirot, he was always there for Act 3. The morning that followed was sharp and cold, with fog rolling in from the garden and clinging to the windows like breath against glass. Poirot stood at the breakfast table, untouched toast on his plate, a newspaper folded beside his teacup, though he had not read a word of it. Across from him sat Clara Vine, her eyes red but her manner composed. She stirred her tea in silence, as if hoping the rhythm might calm her thoughts. Poirot watched her quietly. "Clara," he said after a while, "do you know why Miss Dupree entrusted you with that black book?" Clara blinked. "Because she didn't trust anyone else." "True," Poirot replied, "but not complete. Evelyn was strategic. She gave it to you not only for safekeeping, but to protect you. She knew her time was running short. She must have suspected the real target wasn't her." Clara lowered her spoon. "Then why didn't she say anything?" "Because if she warned you openly, you would have reacted, left, hidden the book, alerted the wrong person. Evelyn understood the power of silence, mademoiselle. She used it until the very end." Poirot folded his hands. "And now we must do the same." By mid-morning, Inspector Nolan had returned with news. Philip Grant had not gone far. He had taken the morning train to a small coastal town, booked a room under an alias, and was traced using a credit receipt from a local cafe. The authorities had been alerted, and a plainclothes officer was dispatched to monitor him without making an arrest on Poirot's advice. No sudden moves. Poirot had said, "We do not need him to run. We need him to believe he has won." That afternoon, Poirot staged a small gathering in the drawing room, less formal than the previous one, more intimate. Present were only those who remained at the estate: Clara Vine, Major Reginald Bexley, Dr. Greaves, and Nolan himself. The servants had been excused. The atmosphere was strange quiet, as if the house was holding its breath. Poirot addressed them calmly. "We have, I believe, uncovered most of the truth, but some questions remain unanswered, and one in particular has begun to weigh heavily on my mind." He turned to Reginald. "You, monsieur, were to inherit this house, and you did, but under altered conditions." Reginald tensed. "Yes. What of it? Someone forged your father's will, not for your benefit, but against it." Evelyn Dupree learned this. She intended to expose the forgery, but she was misled into thinking you were responsible. Reginald frowned. "I never touched the will." Poirot nodded. "I know." He turned to Clara. "And you, mademoiselle, were nearly the victim of a crime that would have been seen as a tragic mistake. Evelyn borrowed your brooch. If she hadn't, you would be dead." Clara said nothing, but her gaze dropped to her lap. Poirot took a breath and delivered his final premise. "We were meant to believe that Lady Honoria had orchestrated everything, an imperious woman with a history of control, a motive to suppress scandal. But Honoria's flaw was not murder. It was cowardice. She knew the forgery had occurred, but she did not commit it. And so, someone else, someone close to the family, yet no longer trusted, stepped forward to correct history, not with legality, but with poison." He pulled from his pocket a sealed envelope and laid it on the table. This letter was written by Evelyn the night she died. It was found inside the lining of her suitcase. Stitched into the fabric, she names her killer. But I have not yet opened it. The room went still. Even Nolan leaned forward slightly, surprised, because Poirot said softly, "I wished to give the killer one final opportunity to confess. Now, before the full weight of the law falls upon him." No one moved. Clara shifted slightly in her seat, glancing at Dr. Greaves, who sat impassive. Reginald stared at the envelope as though it were radioactive. Poirot waited exactly 20 seconds. Then he opened the envelope. Inside was a single page, neatly folded. Poirot read silently, his lips tightening. Then he handed it to Nolan. "It is her handwriting?" Poirot asked. Nolan examined it and nodded. "Yes." Poirot turned to the group. "Evelyn writes, if anything happens to me, it will be because Philip could not stand being powerless. He told me he knew who changed the will. But I believe now he lied. He needed me to believe it was Reginald. He fed me the narrative, but I traced the source. The forged ink matches his hand from a script he gave me years ago. He must have taken the original during the blackout and replaced the amended copy before anyone noticed. I do not think he will let me leave this house alive." Reginald exhaled slowly, like someone who had been underwater too long. Clara closed her eyes. Poirot continued. "It is now a matter of locating Mr. Grant, but I suspect he will not go quietly." Hours later, Poirot and Nolan arrived in the coastal town where Philip had taken refuge. He was seated outside a cafe near the harbor, scribbling in a notebook, a drink beside him. He looked up, startled, when he saw Poirot approach. "Good evening, monsieur," Poirot said. "You seem at ease." Philip closed the notebook slowly. "I thought I was finished with interviews." "Oh, but this is no interview," Poirot said. "You see, the story is over, and you were the author of its tragedy. Evelyn's death was no accident. It was murder, crafted with theatrical flourish, but ruined by its own ambition." Philip's eyes narrowed. "You have no proof?" Poirot raised an eyebrow. "You forget Evelyn wrote the ending herself." Nolan stepped forward. "Philip Grant, you are under arrest for the murders of Evelyn Dupree and Lucien Drake, and for the attempted murder of Clara Vine." Philip's face changed not to fear, but to resignation. She always had to have the last word. Poirot watched him silently as he was taken away. The notebook he'd been writing in was left behind. Poirot picked it up, flipped through the pages. There, written in elegant cursive, was the beginning of a new play. Title: The House of Truth Characters. A woman who knows too much. A man who knows more than he pretends. A legacy no one wants to inherit. Poirot closed the book. "How poetic," he murmured, "but not quite as clever as he believed." He turned toward the sea, his coat catching the wind. The truth, he knew, always found its way to the surface. Even when the story tried to bury it. With Philip Grant arrested and safely in custody, the oppressive tension that had suffocated Montclair estate began to lift. Though slowly, for most of the guests, however, closure remained elusive, tainted by lingering questions. Poirot understood well enough solving a murder might end speculation, but it never completely resolved the human pain it left behind. Upon returning from the coastal town, Poirot did not immediately leave Montclair. Instead, he chose to remain and conduct a few final conversations, quieter, gentler now. Not seeking facts but understanding. He began, as seemed fitting, with Major Reginald Bexley. They sat in the library, the room dim except for a small lamp on the reading table. Reginald, ever stiff, appeared even more withdrawn than usual, his posture rigid as he looked over old photographs lined neatly in an album. Poirot sat opposite, waiting patiently. After several minutes of silence, Reginald finally spoke. "I never understood Evelyn, never saw why men fell for her so easily. She was trouble. Yet," Poirot said softly, "she was intended to inherit alongside you." Reginald exhaled sharply. Father had ideas. Evelyn fascinated him. Philip knew it. He used that knowledge against all of us. Poirot nodded slowly. Philip forged the will to remove you, but in doing so, also placed Evelyn into danger. Had he never interfered, neither she nor Lucien would have died. Reginald's voice grew brittle. He wanted revenge. Humiliation changes a man. It rots something inside. Poirot studied him carefully. "Yet you bear no ill will toward Philip." Reginald frowned. "Hatred serves no purpose now. Evelyn paid the price. Lucien paid the price. Clara nearly did. I have nothing left to feel toward him." Poirot rose and placed a gentle hand on the Major's shoulder. "Sometimes, monsieur, survival itself is a burden. but you bear it well. Next, Poirot met with Dr. Lionel Greaves, the physician's demeanor had hardly changed since their first meeting, steady, reserved, professional. They walked together through the gardens, where summer flowers bloomed in colors too bright for the somber mood. You suspected something from the beginning, did you not? Poirot asked. Greaves hesitated, gazing at a distant fountain. Evelyn was never subtle. The moment she returned, the atmosphere shifted. It felt dangerous. You never spoke openly about your concerns. I had no evidence, Greaves admitted. Only instincts. Doctors rely on facts, not feelings. Poirot gave a slight smile. Yet feelings, monsieur, often lead us to the facts. Greaves looked away thoughtfully. Philip manipulated us all. He used Evelyn's presence to distract us from himself. I admired his work once. He wrote beautifully, but now he sighed heavily, words trailing away. Poirot understood. Now you see him clearly a man whose art turned bitter. The doctor nodded slowly. Exactly after leaving Greaves. In the garden, Poirot returned to the sitting room, where Clara Vine sat alone, sipping tea. Pale but calm, she looked up as he entered, managing a weak smile. Clara, Poirot began gently. You have endured much, but I must ask, did you truly suspect nothing? She hesitated, her hands tightening around the teacup. I suspected Philip disliked Evelyn more deeply than he pretended. But murder? No, never. Poirot watched her carefully. And Evelyn herself, did she seem frightened in her final days? No, Clara said, determined. Perhaps. I think she knew her presence would cause tension. But she underestimated how far Philip would go. Poirot tilted his head slightly. And now, what will you do? She glanced out the window, thoughtful. I'll travel. Evelyn always told me I spent too much time worrying about what others thought. Perhaps it's time to learn who I really am. Poirot nodded gently. A worthy quest, mademoiselle. Finally, he spoke once more with Inspector Nolan, who awaited him by the fireplace. Looking relieved but exhausted. You solved it, Poirot, Nolan said. But I still don't understand. How did you know? The brooch wasn't the true weapon. Poirot smiled faintly. It was a clever misdirection. Philip knew Evelyn borrowed jewelry often, especially from Clara. But digitalis delivered in such a manner was uncertain. He would never leave a murder to chance. No, the brooch was a distraction, a second layer of confusion. The real poison was administered earlier, perhaps in a perfume vial, something Evelyn would have used instinctively, unknowingly. Nolan shook his head, impressed despite himself. You make it sound simple. Non, monsieur, Poirot said with warmth. Nothing about murder is simple. It is always complex, because humans are complex. But that is precisely why it always leaves a trail. They stood in silence, watching the fireplace embers flicker gently. Do you think Montclair estate will recover? Nolan finally asked. Poirot looked around the grand room, at the walls lined with portraits of ancestors, whose gazes remained detached from the present troubles. This house has weathered storms before. It will again. But its people, that is, harder to say. Before he departed Montclair, Poirot made one final private visit to Lady Honoria Bexley, held briefly in custody at the local station. She received him coldly, seated in a plain room, stripped of her accustomed elegance. Yet she held herself with dignity. "You accused me publicly, monsieur," she said evenly. "Now you return to apologize, not apologize, Madame Poirot." Replied carefully, "But to clarify, you did not commit murder, but you were not blameless either." She narrowed her eyes slightly. "I knew about the forgery, but I could never admit it publicly, not even to save Reginald. Reputation is everything." Poirot met her gaze gently. "No, madam. Integrity is everything. Reputation is merely its reflection." She said nothing more, turning away slightly, dismissing him. When Poirot stepped out into the street again, he felt the weight of the entire investigation slowly lifting from him. Each conversation had been its own revelation, not just of facts, but of the subtler truths about how humans handle guilt, loss, and deception. He stood for a moment beneath the waning sunlight. The sky above tinged with the hues of twilight. Soon he would depart, and life would resume changed for all involved, yet still moving forward. But as he prepared to leave Montclair estate behind, Poirot paused once more by the garden path, his eyes drawn to the hedge maze in the distance. He knew now, perhaps more deeply than ever, how much people resembled that maze, carefully constructed, meticulously arranged, yet always concealing something deeper at their center. "Monsieur Poirot." Nolan called softly from behind. Poirot turned, eyebrow lifted slightly. "Yes, Inspector. Will you come back if we ever need you again?" Poirot smiled gently. "If there is ever a mystery, monsieur, that cannot be solved through evidence alone, that requires a deeper understanding of human nature, you may always call upon Hercule Poirot." With that, he tipped his hat and walked slowly toward the waiting car. 3 days had passed since Philip Grant's arrest, and Montclair estate prepared for Poirot's final summation of events. He had delayed his departure at Nolan's request there, remained one last act to play out, a final gathering, not merely for clarification, but to grant closure. Poirot agreed willingly. He understood better than most that truth, no matter how bitter, brought healing. The drawing room was meticulously arranged once more, its aura distinctly different from previous meetings. Each remaining guest had dressed formally, understanding that this assembly represented not accusation, but revelation and unveiling of truth in all its complexity. Present were Major Reginald Bexley, Clara Vine, Dr. Lionel Greaves, Lady Honoria temporarily released into Nolan's custody, and Inspector Nolan himself. Servants hovered discreetly at the room's periphery, silent witnesses to the unfolding drama. Poirot entered with precise punctuality, his manner composed, eyes bright with quiet certainty. He greeted each guest with a nod before positioning himself in the center of the room. "Ms. Amice," Poirot began softly, "we have gathered today not to revisit tragedy, but to clarify exactly what transpired. To people are dead Evelyn, Dupree, and Lucien Drake. Another came perilously close. The man responsible sits in custody. Yet questions linger. Today, I shall resolve them all." Poirot paced slowly, allowing his presence to anchor the room. He turned first to Lady Honoria. "Madam, when Evelyn returned, you felt threatened, not by physical harm, but by scandal. Lady Honoria raised her chin defiantly, though she remained silent. Yet, Poirot continued, you did not conspire to murder. You protected secrets, yes, but never intended violence. You recognized your husband's vulnerability and mistakenly believed you shielded him from disgrace. Your complicity was silence, nothing more. Honoria's gaze softened slightly, a mixture of relief and residual pride. Poirot then turned toward Reginald. Major Bexley, you were deceived into believing your inheritance secure. Philip manipulated you all, casting suspicion upon you, orchestrating doubt about your father's intentions. But, monsieur, your hands remain clean. The estate rightfully belongs to you. The forgery that altered the will was Philip's alone, motivated not by profit, but by vengeance. It was his ultimate act of humiliation against your family. Reginald exhaled audibly, tension leaving his shoulders for the first time in days. Poirot gave him a slight nod, a gentle acknowledgement of innocence reclaimed. Next, Poirot faced Dr. Greaves. You, Doctor, remained a neutral observer. But neutrality often masks discomfort. You saw Philip's manipulations, did you not? Greaves inclined his head solemnly. I suspected. But suspicion is not proof. Poirot nodded. Precisely. Yet suspicion, carefully observed, often points us toward truth. You remained cautious, wary. You warned Evelyn subtly, discreetly urging her caution, though she rarely listened. You acted honorably, monsieur, within your own limitations. Greaves nodded slowly, thoughtfully, saying nothing more. Finally, Poirot turned to Clara Vine. Seated quietly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Clara, Poirot said gently, you suffered more than most. Evelyn entrusted you with dangerous knowledge she herself misunderstood. You narrowly escaped a fate intended not merely to silence you, but to frame others. Philip carefully manipulated your vulnerabilities. He knew Evelyn borrowed your jewelry often, thereby crafting a scenario he hoped would incriminate another. Yet chance saved your life, though at the expense of Evelyn's. Clara swallowed hard, blinking rapidly, absorbing Poirot's words quietly. Poirot paused briefly, the room utterly silent, the only sound the gentle ticking of an antique clock. When he resumed speaking, his voice was softer, reflective. Philip Grant's crime was multifaceted. Driven by a profound bitterness, his humiliation by Evelyn years ago never healed. Instead, it festered into something monstrous. He planned meticulously not just the murder, but the aftermath. He forged Lord Bexley's will, intending originally only disgrace, not murder. Yet Evelyn's return forced his hand. Her threat of exposure shifted his plot from mere revenge to something far darker. Poirot raised one finger, but Philip's fatal flaw was overconfidence. He believed himself an author who could control human nature like characters on a page. He underestimated that humans are unpredictable, nuanced. Evelyn borrowed Clara's brooch, a simple human action he never anticipated. Thus, Evelyn herself became the accidental victim, causing Philip's careful illusion to unravel. Inspector Nolan cleared his throat gently. Philip's confession this morning confirms everything Poirot has said. He detailed precisely how he administered digitalis not through the brooch itself, but through Evelyn's perfume bottle. which he contaminated earlier that day, ensuring she would unknowingly poison herself. The brooch was planted later to divert suspicion, to frame Clara and implicate Honoria. Gasps murmured softly through the room, each person recognizing the depth of Philip's cunning and cruelty. Poirot nodded appreciatively toward Nolan. "Merci, Inspector. Indeed. Philip's confession is comprehensive. He believed the truth would never surface. Confident until the very end. But he misunderstood human resolve. His victims fought back, even from beyond death." Poirot moved slowly around the room, his eyes meeting each person directly. "You each carry scars from these events. Innocence does not erase pain. Neither does justice entirely heal it. But clarity, Ms. Amis, allows life to resume. It permits healing to begin." Lady Honoria spoke softly, breaking the room's silence. "Will this scandal define Montclair forever?" Poirot regarded her gently. "No, madam. Scandals fade. Only truth remains permanent. And the truth here is complicated, but redemptive. That your estate endured not due to secrecy, but because truth ultimately prevailed." She inclined her head slightly, accepting this answer with quiet dignity. Poirot then addressed the entire room once more. "Remember this. Murder never begins with a knife or poison. It begins quietly, invisibly in resentment, humiliation, pride. It thrives in darkness, grows in silence." Philip's tragedy was not simply Evelyn's betrayal. It was his inability to forgive. His poison was bitterness long before it was digitalis. Poirot paused thoughtfully, allowing this reflection to linger. Finally, he smiled faintly. "Now, Ms. Amis, let this be the true lesson of Montclair Estate. Forgiveness and understanding can defeat bitterness before it becomes deadly." The room gradually relaxed, murmurs of quiet agreement passing among the guests. Inspector Nolan stepped forward once more, addressing them formally. "I thank you all for your cooperation and patience during this investigation. Justice will be served, but remember, as Monsieur Poirot suggests, justice is not vengeance, it is understanding." Poirot inclined his head toward Nolan appreciatively. The inspector had grown throughout this investigation. His understanding deepened considerably. As the guests began quietly departing, Reginald approached Poirot, extending his hand earnestly. "You have restored dignity to this house, Poirot. Thank you." Poirot accepted their handshake gently. "Non, monsieur, dignity was always here. I merely cleared away shadows obscuring it." As the guests dispersed completely, leaving Poirot briefly alone, he stood near the grand window, gazing thoughtfully across the grounds. Evening had fallen. Stars began flickering softly against the twilight. Soon, he too would depart, leaving Montclair behind. Yet, he knew the lessons learned here would linger within the walls, the gardens, the memories of all who remained at last. Hercule Poirot felt closure settling gently upon Montclair Estate, knowing well he had done all he could to restore peace not simply through detection, but through understanding. Would you like to continue with the final section, Section 12, the conclusion and final reveal? Poirot stood quietly in the dim study of Montclair Estate, the soft glow from a desk lamp illuminating the tidy stacks of paper and old family portraits lining the walls. It was late. Most guests had retired to their rooms, leaving the house, cloaked in a thoughtful silence. Inspector Nolan had departed after ensuring all necessary arrangements were made for Philip Grant's trial. With justice firmly in hand, Poirot finally allowed himself a quiet moment of reflection. But even as he stood, seemingly at ease, his mind continued to sift and sort the intricacies of human behavior he had witnessed over the past several days. Poirot understood that murder investigations never truly ended at the capture of the culprit. Echoes lingered, ripples radiating outward, touching everyone connected to the tragedy. A gentle knock on the study door interrupted his thoughts. Clara Vine stepped quietly into the room, hesitant yet resolved. "Monsieur Poirot," she began softly. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Poirot offered a reassuring smile. "Not at all, mademoiselle. Please, come in." Clara approached slowly, her eyes searching his face for reassurance. "I wanted to thank you, not just for solving Evelyn's murder, but for understanding her. Most people never did. They saw only her beauty, her charm, never the woman beneath." Poirot nodded gently. "And you saw her clearly?" Clara hesitated, then nodded. "I did." Evelyn hid behind bravado because vulnerability terrified her. "She trusted few people, but she trusted you, I believe, even indirectly." Poirot's eyebrow lifted slightly. "Indirectly?" Clara smiled faintly. "She once mentioned you, before returning here. She said if anyone could see through masks, it was Hercule Poirot. I think she knew her visit might provoke trouble. Perhaps she even hoped you would be nearby when she needed help." Poirot's expression softened further. "And yet, help arrived too late. Not entirely," Clara said earnestly. "Her death was tragic, yes, but because of you, the truth has been uncovered. Philip's hatred, hidden so long, finally revealed. Perhaps Evelyn's greatest legacy is clarity. Even in death, she refused to remain silent." Poirot considered this carefully, deeply touched. "A beautiful sentiment, mademoiselle. Truth is indeed Evelyn's final victory." Clara nodded, eyes moist but resolute. "I will honor her memory by living fully, by never again hiding behind fear." Poirot inclined his head gently. "That, Clara, is the greatest tribute anyone could offer." After Clara departed, Poirot remained alone in the study for several minutes more. Deeply moved by her words, he knew then, with absolute certainty, that the human spirit, though fragile, possessed incredible resilience. At last, Poirot gathered his coat and hat and moved quietly through the halls of Montclair estate for the final time. As he stepped onto the porch, preparing to leave, he noticed Reginald Bexley standing alone near the front steps. Gazing across the darkened grounds, Poirot joined him silently. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Reginald broke the quiet. "I thought I knew this house, my family, myself, but the last few days have made me question everything." Poirot replied gently. "Perhaps that is good, monsieur. Questions keep us alive, keep us humble. We must never believe we fully understand anyone, including ourselves." Reginald sighed heavily. "You knew from the beginning, didn't you, that Evelyn was not the intended victim?" Poirot nodded slowly. "Evelyn's death was accidental, a tragic error, Philip intended Clara to perish. Knowing suspicion would fall elsewhere, Evelyn's habit of borrowing jewelry inadvertently saved Clara and ended Evelyn's life. Reginald shook his head slowly, his expression pained. Such needless tragedy. Indeed, Poirot agreed softly, but tragedy often reveals deeper truths. Evelyn's death exposed Philip's poisonous heart one that had festered quietly for years. And in revealing his darkness, it also showed your integrity, Clara's courage, and Honoria's human frailty. Reginald glanced toward Poirot, his eyes earnest. Do you truly believe people can change? Poirot, after all this. Poirot smiled faintly. Not all change, monsieur, but many learn. Some grow wiser, gentler. Evelyn's tragedy may teach compassion, humility. If that happens, perhaps her death holds meaning beyond grief. Reginald exhaled slowly, nodding thoughtfully. I'll do my best to honor that meaning. Poirot, I know you will, Poirot assured him quietly. You already have. With that, Poirot descended the steps and moved toward the waiting car. Behind him, Montclair Estate stood quiet yet resilient, its windows reflecting the gentle starlight above. As the vehicle slowly pulled away, Poirot felt peace settle within him, knowing he had done all he could not merely as a detective, but as a man who understood deeply the fragile, complex nature of humanity. Later, aboard the night train returning to London, Poirot opened Evelyn's small journal once more, turning its pages carefully. Near the end, he discovered a brief note, something he had overlooked previously, written hastily, as though added as an afterthought. There is one person in the world who might unravel this. If I fail, his name is Hercule Poirot. If anyone can decipher a murder hidden behind a mistake, it is him. If this reaches him too late, perhaps he'll forgive me for never seeking his help directly. Poirot closed the journal gently, deeply touched. There is nothing to forgive, cher Evelyn, he whispered quietly to himself. Your voice spoke clearly enough. He set the book aside, settled back comfortably in his seat, and gazed out the window as night slipped quietly past. His thoughts drifted gently through memories of Montclaret's tragedies. Yes, but also its moments of dignity, courage, and grace. Each life there had been forever changed by the events of recent days. Yet he knew with certainty those who remained would move forward not unmarked, but wiser and perhaps kinder. Eventually, Poirot allowed himself a slight smile, eyes twinkling faintly beneath the brim of his hat. Another mystery resolved. He murmured softly to himself, but human nature, that remains the greatest mystery of all. Outside, darkness gradually softened into dawn, bringing with it a quiet sense of renewal. Poirot closed his eyes, listening gently to the rhythmic sounds of the train. He knew there would be more mysteries in the future, more complexities waiting to be untangled. But for now, this case had reached its conclusion, tragic, yes, but also hopeful. Poirot knew deeply that justice had been served not merely through law, but through truth itself. And as the train continued onward, he finally allowed himself the comfort of rest, secure in the knowledge that Evelyn's legacy had indeed become one of clarity and courage. At last, Hercule Poirot drifted into peaceful sleep, satisfied that, Once again his little grey cells had performed admirably, guiding truth from darkness into light. Days after Philip Grant's arrest, Montclair Estate finally began to reclaim some semblance of peace. The whispers and shadows of suspicion faded, replaced by the solemn dignity of truth. Poirot, having lingered at the request of Inspector Nolan, knew his work was now complete. Still, he felt compelled to address the residents one final time, offering them closure and a profound reflection on human nature and justice. In the estate's drawing room, sunlight streamed gently through tall windows, illuminating a small gathering: Major Reginald Bexley, Clara Vine, Dr. Lionel Greaves, Lady Honoria, who had since been cleared of murder but still bore the quiet shame of her complicity, and Inspector Nolan, who stood respectfully beside Poirot. Poirot took his place at the center, his demeanor calm yet firm, eyes bright with insight and compassion. "My friends," Poirot began softly, "this case has tested each of you greatly. It was, from the start, a crime layered with deception. Philip Grant believed he could orchestrate murder like a playwright directs a drama controlling all players, every twist scripted perfectly. Yet, human nature is not so easily scripted. He turned first to Major Reginald Bexley. "Monsieur, you were wrongly suspected. Philip's forgery aimed to deny your rightful inheritance, to humiliate your family. He used Evelyn's presence to sow doubt, knowing suspicion would naturally turn toward you. But you, monsieur, have shown honor. You weathered suspicion with dignity, and today justice restores your name." Reginald nodded quietly, a heavy burden visibly lifting from his shoulders. Poirot's gaze moved gently to Clara Vine. "Mademoiselle, you were an innocent pawn in Philip's cruel plot. Your kindness nearly cost you your life. Evelyn's decision to borrow your brooch inadvertently sealed her fate, but spared yours. Honor her sacrifice, Clara." By living courageously, Clara's eyes shimmered softly, but determination had replaced her earlier fear. "I will," she promised quietly. Poirot's attention shifted briefly to Dr. Greaves. "Doctor, your caution was wise. You recognized danger, advising Evelyn prudently. Though you could not prevent tragedy, your actions were commendable. Continue, trusting your instincts. They serve you well." Greaves inclined his head appreciatively. "Thank you." Poirot's tone softened as he faced Lady Honoria. "Madam, your role in this tragedy was passive yet painful. By protecting family secrets, you unintentionally shielded a murderer. May this painful lesson remind us all that silence in the face of wrongdoing carries consequences." Lady Honoria met his gaze, humbled yet dignified. "I understand now, monsieur." Poirot nodded, satisfied. Finally, he turned respectfully toward Inspector Nolan. "Inspector, your diligence ensured justice. Remember, every investigation requires not merely evidence, but empathy. Let this case guide your future with compassion." Nolan straightened slightly, nodding solemnly. "It will, Poirot. Thank you." Poirot paused thoughtfully, allowing silence to gently embrace the room before delivering his final reflection. Philip Grant's tragedy was not merely Evelyn's rejection years ago. It was poisonous pride, festering silently over years. He chose vengeance over forgiveness, bitterness over peace, Such choices inevitably consume us, transforming victims into villains. The room held a respectful quiet, absorbing Poirot's wisdom. At last, he concluded gently, "Let Montclair Estate's legacy be honesty, courage, forgiveness. Tragedy teaches harsh lessons, but only if we are willing to learn." His words lingered meaningfully. One by one, guests began quietly dispersing, deeply moved by his final reflections. Eventually, Poirot stood alone with Inspector Nolan. "I shall leave now, Inspector. Justice has been served. The future is in your capable hands." Nolan smiled warmly, extending his hand. "Thank you, Poirot. I won't forget what I've learned." Poirot took Nolan's hand warmly. "Nor shall I forget you, Inspector." Outside, Poirot paused briefly, gazing at Montclair Estate one final time. Its stately beauty peaceful beneath the afternoon sun. He felt satisfaction not simply at solving the crime, but at guiding wounded hearts toward understanding. Truth had prevailed, yet he knew healing would continue slowly, quietly, in the days ahead. At last, Poirot climbed into the waiting car, tipping his hat respectfully toward Nolan, who watched him depart. The car pulled gently away, leaving Montclair Estate gradually receding behind. As the landscape blurred gently past, Poirot allowed himself quiet reflection. Murder always wounded deeply, yet its aftermath often revealed humanity's profound capacity for resilience. Evelyn Dupree's tragic death had, in its own way, illuminated deeper truths. Clara discovered courage, Reginald reclaimed dignity, and even Lady Honoria confronted uncomfortable honesty. From tragedy had grown wisdom and renewal. In London days later, newspapers reported Philip Grant's full confession, offering detailed accounts of his meticulous plotting, driven by long-held bitterness. Justice was clear, swift, and unequivocal. Philip would face trial, but Poirot had little doubt the courts would find him guilty without hesitation. Weeks passed. Life at Montclair Estate slowly resumed, quiet, thoughtful, but hopeful. Reginald hosted quiet dinners again. Clara pursued plans to travel, and Dr. Greaves continued his diligent service to the local community. Lady Honoria, deeply humbled, supported charitable causes quietly, understanding at last the cost of silence. One afternoon, Poirot received a letter postmarked from Montclair. He opened it gently, recognizing Clara's careful handwriting. "Dear Monsieur Poirot, I write simply to thank you not only for your brilliance in solving Evelyn's murder, but for teaching us courage and compassion. Montclair Estate owes you a debt beyond words. We will never forget you. Respectfully, Clara Vine." Poirot folded the letter thoughtfully, deeply moved by her gratitude. He knew Clara, Reginald, and the others had truly learned from tragedies. Harsh lessons. Settling back comfortably in his armchair, Poirot allowed himself a quiet, satisfied smile. Another mystery resolved, not merely by reason, but through profound understanding of human hearts. At last, Hercule Poirot's little grey cells rested, contented once more.